I know you're busy, so is it cool if I tape us?
Yeah, please feel free.
Awesome.
I'm driving around Iowa, so this is actually a pretty good time.
Excellent. Well, I do appreciate it. I have had some weird things with my phone today. If we should happen to drop, that's what it is, and I will contact your press person.
No, I'll just call you back. It's fine.
Okay. So I guess I'm very interested in. I've talked to some libertarians who are pretty. These are not like fly-by-night libertarians. These are people who are like involved in the libertarian movement. And they said, one guy said he went to one of your rallies in D.C. at the Lincoln Memorial, and he saw a bunch of people there who were kind of like pulling their ball caps down, like not making eye contact, who were libertarians. And I guess my first question is, did you know about this? And I'd love to get your take on why you think you are appealing to non-liberal identified voters.
Well, I think that many voters of every political alignment find it refreshing when someone's just focused on the problems and trying to find paths and solutions forward. And I think that libertarians in particular like the idea of the freedom dividend, since it was proposed by leading economists like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, who are identified with libertarian thought. And there was a quote in my book that I quote a friend of mine, Andy Stern, but I obviously agree with the sentiment, which is that our government is bad at many things, but it's excellent at sending large numbers of checks to large numbers of people promptly and reliably. And so I think when libertarians hear me say things like that, I say things like that because I believe them, then they think, ooh, like this guy and I might actually have some things in common.
Yeah. So I've heard you on Joe Rogan and Ben Shapiro, and really enjoyed them both. But I understand that the Joe Rogan podcast really helped propel you, and obviously that's not like a normal way. I think I read someone who wrote like most of these people are launching their campaigns on The View, and you actually went to a larger audience, the Joe Rogan podcast. How important was that from your standpoint, going on that show?
It was a tremendous opportunity, and it certainly launched our campaign by any of the measurable dimensions where our web traffic spiked, our individual donations surged. And so I think it's another reason why we're getting support among people who identify as libertarians, because I think that many libertarians saw that interview with Joe.
Ah, that's good. So, I mean, like along those lines, you obviously have an appeal. You're resonating with people who are not on the left. Why are you running in a Democratic primary? Would you have ever considered running like in a Republican primary?
If you look at the website, you'll see that I have many policies that I think associated with the Democratic Party in terms of particularly various social issues like reproductive rights, criminal justice reform, and others. If you were to ask me what I consider myself, I have been a registered Democrat for a long time, but I think that unfortunately the Democratic Party has lost touch with the day-to-day experience of many Americans, and has started to get preoccupied with things that may or may not be as crucial to someone's lived experience. The Democratic Party could use some new ideas. When someone asks me why I'm running as a Democrat, I've been a registered Democrat for a long time, and I think the Democratic Party could benefit from some new energy and new ideas. Though it's also the case that, practically speaking, if you were to run as an independent or libertarian, you would almost certainly be marginalized and ignored throughout this process, and the odds of you changing the conversation or even winning would be very, very low. Whereas in the Democratic primary, I think we have a chance to contend and win the whole thing.
So, someone I was talking to who has really liked your message is worried that you're going to feel pressure, sort of a peer pressure in the debates, that you may get off your message, which I think is a unique message, and kind of be sucked into, the mainstream liberal message. Is that something you're concerned about, and any thoughts on how to avoid that trap?
It is a concern because the format of the debate suggests that I'm likely to receive only 10 to 12 minutes of airtime. And obviously those questions that I'm asked could be things that are not directly centered around my campaign's message.
Right.
And so I could either be the candidate who ignores the question and just talks about my own stuff, which I think is somewhat obnoxious, and voters don't like that. For good reason, because, you get asked a question.
Right.
So if I happen to get asked questions about things that have nothing to do with the thrust of my campaign, then I could get steered off message, and that is a concern. But happily, I've qualified for both the June and July debates, so I'll have a couple of opportunities to introduce myself to the American people. And also, we're creating our own opportunities where I don't think it would be very wise to think we're going to live and die by a couple of debates.
Yeah. No, that's interesting, because I've actually faced the same choice myself on TV sometimes.
Oh, I'm sure you have, man. I mean, you're a regular on these things, so then you start asking you questions like, I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah, and when they're paying you, like as a commentator, you have even more of an obligation to answer their question instead of like the one you want to answer. So it's a challenge.
I'm just kidding.
Oh, let's see. I definitely. So one of the.
Pay me for any of these appearances.
Well, yeah, no, that's why I think you definitely have more of an option to be like, look, the real issue is what nobody's talking about, which is the fact that the biggest job in 29 states is truck driver, and we're gonna be losing millions of jobs. One thing that people I'm talking to who like you but are conservative or libertarian, and this is actually my concern too, is like the limiting principle. And I know Ben Shapiro asked you about this, but it really does seem like a dangerous scenario where like you could potentially open the door to the idea that the government should be giving people $1,000 a month. And because you have established that premise, you could be outbid by like Elizabeth Warren that says, it should actually be $5,000 a month. I know you've sort of addressed this before, but this is the one area where I really think it's a sticking point for some ideologically committed conservatives and libertarians. I mean, like, is there anything that you would tell them other than trust politicians? Because I don't think we do. What would you say to people who are worried about that, like, slippery slope?
Yeah, it's a legitimate concern. So passionate that this is the path we need to go on, is that people who have that concern are right now concerned about the general swallowing up of the federal budget by our current roster of entitlement programs. The enrollments in many of them continue to rise. And so the question is whether you want to have a set of programs that do have many perverse and negative incentives attached to them, just continue to grow as both a portion of the federal budget as well as the number of Americans that they affect, or whether you prefer to try and move towards a system that has more positive incentives attached to it, because we're heading in that general direction one way or another. Mm-hmm. I suppose is the especially if the fourth industrial revolution truly does upend the livelihoods of millions of Americans, which in my mind 100% will, And so if you're heading in that direction, then do you want to allow for just the ongoing creeping growth of various programs the way they're currently structured, or would you rather try and design something new? So that's my thought process on it. It's like, are there hazards attached to it? There are hazards attached to just about any approach, including inaction. And so the hope is that if we put these resources to work in Americans' hands, that we can manage it responsibly. But the other aspect of it, too, is that it is at least conceivable that we could wind up in a situation where we can innovate and grow our way out of a lot of this, where if, 100 years from now, everyone getting $5,000 a month might actually be feasible because we have artificial intelligence that's doing like incredible things. So, we shouldn't necessarily foreclose the ability to put ourselves on that kind of path, because the alternative path is almost certainly disastrous over time.
Would you look if we knew that automation was not going to be as, let's say we found out that we're overrating the impact of automation, it's not going to be as damaging, would you still destruct UBI like in its own right, even if that weren't, a pressing danger?
Well, it's hard for me to imagine, because I've spent so many years working in various parts of the economy where if you then say, hey, automation is not going to cause problems, I'd be like I don't even understand how that's possible. Given that, right now we're driving through Iowa, and Iowa's lost 40,000 manufacturing jobs and 12,000 retail jobs. Then it has another 178,000 retail jobs. And I mean, who the heck thinks those are still going to be here in the next number of years? And so then the question is what kind of transitions those workers can make. And a lot of this is really the path between here and there, where if you have, let's say, a couple million Americans who can't make the transition, that's, I mean, it's going to be more than a couple million. I mean, it's more than a couple million right now. So in many ways, the challenge is and this is people who have a bit more confidence in our ability to tailor various solutions, where it's like, oh, we'll just try and get resources to those people. It's like, well, then how can you figure out exactly who's being affected in the time frame? So first, it's just hard for me to imagine a world where automation is not going to be a massive problem, because we're experiencing it right now. But if you were to say, hey, would I be for universal basic income or negative income tax independent of that? I would anyway, because I do think that the incentives attached to our current welfare programs are debilitating for many, many Americans. And I think replacing them with more positive incentives would be a game changer for a huge number of people. And also, I believe that right now there's just a lot of unnecessary human capital loss and suffering going on that is completely unnecessary. That people are making bad decisions because of the situation, because people with certain deprivations or certain exigencies or day-to-day stresses are more likely to make really bad, unnecessary decisions, and that if we can change that, we should.
Yeah. So you alluded earlier that Democrats are not not reaching out to all Americans, and that they're making some mistakes. What, other than automation, what are Democrats wrong about?
Well, certainly the core thing is trying to explain how Donald Trump got elected, and there's been this, to me, somewhat unfortunate classification of Trump voters as if it's they're clearly monolithic group, when in my mind there are a million different reasons that an American could have voted for Donald Trump. So to me, and you say that this is aside from automation, but it's the question is, how did we get to a point where tens of millions of Americans thought voting for Donald Trump was a good idea? So certainly the evolving economy is a major part of that, and that Democrats should be laser focused on how to improve the economic futures of the millions of Americans whose situations have changed. I think that the Democrats have lost touch with many working class Americans who, when I meet them, that there's like a real mistrust of Democrats, which I found shocking initially, but like now I've heard it a number of times, where there's just a lot of people who don't think the Democratic Party stands for them. And one recent question that came up that's like an emblem of this is that people were asked, is it okay for the Democrats to have their national convention funded by corporate interests? And to me, like the shoddier and jankier like the convention, the better. There's no reason why the National Convention has to look like the Academy Awards, to quote Robert Reich. So that wasn't my line, that was his. But you know, the American people at this point can tell what's going on, and that like the balloons don't matter to the American people. Like what matters to the American people is whether they feel like their representatives are actually fighting for them, and not some other set of interests. So those are a couple of things I think that Democrats could focus on to better affect that there's like I also think that the emphasis on somehow abolishing the Electoral College is a ridiculous point of view. I mean, one, it would require a constitutional amendment, which is completely impossible to do. It would advantage urban areas, which is one of the pitfalls that Democrats are falling into right now, which is that it's getting redefined as the urban party. And so if you don't live in an urban area, you feel like the Democratic Party doesn't care about you. And then because if you had popular vote, then campaigns would naturally be centered in more densely populated major media markets. But then the third thing that might be the most damaging is saying we're losing, so we need to change the rules. Like, even though the Electoral College has obviously been enshrined in the Constitution, it's been with us for decades. So having that approach to me is something that's really damaging, because if you're, let's say, like someone who's an independent in one of these states, you're like, wait a minute, like the Democrats just want to change the system so that, like, you know, like my votes don't matter as much because they want other people's votes to perhaps, you know, like matter more, like on a relative basis, even though I do understand the simplicity and the appeal of popular elections. So those are some of the things I disagree with the Democrats on. Or at least, you know, I'm not sure all of them are for abolishing the Electoral College, but at least some of them are.
You know, in some places like in New Hampshire, I know that Republicans who are running in New Hampshire, so like a John McCain or a John Kasich, will try to get Democrats to vote for them in a primary. Do you want, like, young Republicans and young Libertarians to, like, leave Trump and come vote for you? Is that, I mean, that may be happening anyway, but, like, is that something that strategically you're attempting to do?
Very much so. And, you know, if you ask Democrats what their number one criterion is for their candidate, it's someone who can beat Donald Trump. And so I would suggest that a candidate who's peeling off conservatives and independents and Republicans and libertarians who vote for Donald Trump be a candidate to beat Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So we are thrilled when someone comes to our rallies and says, I voted for Donald Trump and now I want to support you. And over time, more and more Democrats and progressives will wake up to the fact that that's exactly the kind of campaign we need to run nationally in order to win in 2020.
And this is a weird question, but my editor wanted me to ask it. So, what do you see as America's role in the world?
Well, I think we've been the beneficiaries of a global world order that we helped establish, and to the extent that we can continue to benefit from that and maintain that, then we should. But at the same time, we have also overextended ourselves and deluded ourselves into thinking that we can make things happen in certain countries or rebuild certain countries in a way that was not within our capacity. So I think our role in the world is evolving and changing, but I would be very restrained and judicious about what we can get done abroad, and how long it will take us to do and what the resources are. So I think that role is, for better or for worse, changing as we speak.
Awesome. Well, hey, terrific talking to you.